5. In Defense of Biblical Bribery by Gary North. The three heresies of humanism, moralism, and legalism often manifest themselves simultaneously, even in supposedly Christian circles. All three center their focus on man. The primary assumption of humanism is that man, his goals, needs, desires, standards, is the central focus of life. It argues that man is not merely God's vicegerent over the creation, laboring in order to achieve dominion over the earth for the glory of God, but rather that the earth is to be subdued, quote, by the people, for the people, end quote, as if creation were of the people. Moralism is grounded on the doctrine that man is capable of demonstrating his own worth before God by acts of charity and self-denial. Moralists strive toward, quote-unquote, being good through acts of inherent goodness. Legalism is usually a parallel creed of moralism. God is viewed as being bound by the same laws that bind mankind. God, like his creation, is under law and must therefore conform himself to the desires and demands of men who act in terms of his law. Legalism is a blood relative of magic, since the magician also seeks to manipulate reality by means of rigid incantations and self-abnegation, compelling the secret powers to perform in accord with the prescribed formulas. Legalism must assume the validity of moralism, and both are essentially humanistic. The salvation of man is accomplished by the deeds of man. Orthodox Christianity, by definition, denies all three positions. Against humanism, Christianity asserts the sovereignty of God. The whole creation must give God all the glory, for that is its function. Isaiah 45:22-23, Romans 14:11, Philippians 2:10-11. Against moralism, Christianity says that there is nothing in man that can ever merit favor in God's eyes. Man is totally depraved. All our righteousness is as filthy rags. Isaiah 64:6. Sanctification is therefore equally as much a gift from God as is justification. A man's heart deviseth his way, but the Lord directeth his steps. Proverbs 16:9. In short, moralism, by asserting man's intrinsic worthiness, is fallacious. Finally, Christianity rejects legalism, even as it rejects magic. God is above his creation. Law is under God, not over him. God covenants with man, of course, but the perversion and rebellion of man invariably leads to a situation where God's covenant blessings are delivered only because of Christ's ultimate righteousness. Man receives a blessing only because of his participation in the covenant through faith, or, lacking saving faith, only because he lives in a universe temporarily shielded from God's wrath out of God's respect for Christ, Christ's people, and Christ's work in time. Calvin, Institutes of the Christian Religion. God is in no way compelled by the feeble attempts at righteousness by the legalist or the manipulations by the magician to respect the cry of man. God can resist the legalistic manipulations of men. A failure of recognition of this basic fact led Job, as well as his three comforters, into a sinful misinterpretation of God's sovereign plan. Job 32-41. Orthodox Christianity declares that God is totally sovereign over his creation. He may do with it as he pleases, bestowing wrath or grace as he sees fit. He can make light and darkness, peace or evil, Isaiah 45:9, and none may charge him with sin or error, Romans 9:19 and following. The purposes of the laws of God are invariably theocentric, not humanistic. Any Christian who gives tacit approval in principle to what has been said so far can test himself in terms of several biblical particulars. Is law truly theocentric? Should our obedience be in terms of a covenantal law structure that aims solely at the glory of God? If so, then in what way should we regard the activities of Rahab? It must be pointed out that the Bible is unhesitating in its praise of Rahab. Both the author of Hebrews 11:31 and James 2:25 testify to her wisdom in deciding to shield the Hebrew spies, and no criticism is given of her method of doing so. We are specifically told that for her actions she received a reward, Joshua 6:25. She made a covenant with the two representatives of the Hebrew nation, Joshua 2:12 and following, and, by way of implication, with the God of the Hebrews. By faith she was justified, showing her faith by her works. Here is the message of Rahab through the ages. The harlot who was grafted into the covenant line of Christ, Matthew 1:5, the only survivor, along with her family, of the fall of Jericho, was clearly favored by God. There is not the slightest hint anywhere in the Bible that any aspect of her defense of the Hebrew spies is in some way suspect. Calvinists, including Calvin, have rushed in where angels fear to tread. Legalism runs deep in the rebellious hearts of men. Rahab, we find, had to resort to lying in order to protect her visitors, Joshua 2:3 and following. In his explanation of verse 4, Calvin writes of her treason in abandoning her people that, quote, there was no criminality in abandoning them, end quote. However, her lie is not so easily dismissed. Quote, as to the falsehood, we must admit that though it was done for a good purpose, it was not free from fault. For those who hold what is called a dutiful lie to be altogether excusable do not sufficiently consider how precious truth is in the sight of God. And yet the particular fault does not wholly deprive the deed of the merit of holy zeal, for by the kindness of God the fault is suppressed and not taken into account. Rahab was wrong when she falsely declares that the messengers were gone, and yet the principal action was agreeable to God because the bad, mixed up with the good, was not imputed. End quote. Calvin set the precedent, and Calvinistic commentators have tended to follow his example. Very little space is devoted to Rahab's crime of treason, but the lie which she used in order to commit treason has come under close scrutiny. Matthew Poole, the 17th century Puritan commentator, minced no words. Quote, I wist not whence they were. Her answer, contained in these and the following words, was palpably false, and therefore unquestionably sinful. Howsoever, her intention was good therein. See Romans 3:8, end quote. Nevertheless, it is a modern commentator who brings Calvinistic legalism to its highest point in the treatment of Rahab, although he would deny being a legalist as previously defined. So desperate is he to avoid the obvious implications of Rahab's example, that lying is legitimate in some cases and that God can be glorified in a lie, that he resorts to the most embarrassing kind of exegetical squirming. Quote, the vindication of deliberate untruth under certain circumstances receives more plausible support from the case of Rahab, the harlot. That Rahab uttered an explicit falsehood is apparent. How could her conduct in reference to the spies be so commended, we might say, if the untruth by which she shielded them were itself wrong? It should not go unnoticed that the New Testament scriptures which commend Rahab for her faith and works make allusion solely to the fact that she received the spies and sent them out another way. No question can be raised as to the propriety of these actions or of hiding the spies from the emissaries of the king of Jericho. And the approval of these actions does not logically, or in terms of the analogy provided by Scripture, carry with it the approval of the specific untruth spoken to the king of Jericho. It is a strange theology which will insist that the approval of her faith and works in receiving the spies and helping them to escape must embrace the approval of all the actions associated with her praiseworthy conduct. And if it is objected that the preservation of the spies and the sequel of sending them out another way could not have been accomplished apart from the untruth uttered, and that the untruth is integral to the successful outcome of her action, there are three things to be borne in mind. 1. We are presuming too much in reference to the providence of God when we say that the untruth was indispensable to the successful outcome of her believing action. 2. Granting that, in the de facto providence of God, the untruth was one of the means through which the spies escaped, it does not follow that Rahab was morally justified in using this method. God fulfills his holy, decretive will through our unholy acts. Point 3 compares Jacob's lie to Isaac and the resulting blessing. The blessing was justified, the lie was wrong. We see, therefore, that neither Scripture itself, nor the theological references derived from Scripture, provide us with any warrant for the vindication of Rahab's untruth, and this instance, consequently, does not support the position that under certain circumstances we may justifiably utter an untruth. End quote. What we see, on the contrary, is the difficulty of imposing onto the account of Rahab the legalistic limitations of a strained exegesis. Rahab's great faith and works burst such legalistic limits as thoroughly as Samson burst his ropes. This hyper-cautious exegesis simply refuses to come to grips with the plain teaching of Scripture. Rahab was justified in God's eyes, and not a single word in the whole of Scripture's references to her hints at any wrongdoing on her part. And consider the author's statement that, quote, "no question can be raised as to the propriety of these actions or of hiding the spies from the emissaries of the king of Jericho," end quote. In short, treason, under the circumstances, was perfectly normal, utterly reasonable. But the sin of lying, how awful! Legalism strains at the ethical gnat and swallows the ethical camel. To return the author's own barb, this is indeed a strange theology. The author does not seem to comprehend the extent to which he is committed to the very legalism which his own theology of grace and principle denies. If only she hadn't lied, our commentators seem to be saying, then she would have been truly holy. Holy indeed, she would have been holier than God Himself required of her, which is the ultimate goal of all consistently applied legalism. Her lie, by all the standards of the ancient world, involved her in treason against the gods of her city. To covenant with Israel's God inevitably meant blasphemy and treason against the gods of the established culture, a fact made inescapably clear to Christians in the Roman Empire. Even the most committed legalist cannot escape this fact. So, legalists do not criticize Rahab for treason, for that was necessary by definition, but only for her lie, which quote-unquote somehow was not necessary. The capital crime of treason is sometimes legitimate, the legalist admits. The sin of telling a lie is always unrighteous. The world of legalism is an upside-down universe. We should expect this, for all forms of humanism reverse the order of creation. It may be objected that such an exegesis of Rahab as the quoted example represents is not legalistic, given the definition offered at the beginning of this essay. There is no explicit statement that God is bound by certain laws and that man can manipulate God in some way. True enough, there is no explicit statement of this kind. But it is clearly stated that, quote, "we are presuming too much in reference to the providence of God when we say that the untruth was indispensable to the successful outcome of her believing action," end quote. The critics of Rahab's lie apparently think her case is analogous to David's adultery with Bathsheba, a union which ultimately produced Solomon. We are not, of course, bound to praise David's actions simply because Solomon's rule produced many desirable results, such as the construction of God's temple. We are specifically told that David's adultery was abhorrent in the eyes of God. We are not so informed about Rahab's actions. It is dangerous exegetically to read into the story of Rahab's sin which is not explicitly shown to be present, especially in the face of such overwhelming biblical praise of her actions. Thus, we find Rahab's critics arguing that in some unstated way she could have responded truthfully or remained silent while simultaneously preserving the lives of the spies. God just had to have some alternative plan to put into operation. If she had not lied to the king's men, she still would have survived somehow, and the spies would have escaped, and Jericho would have fallen. In other words, because man does good, God must see to it that his plan produces good. God is therefore bound to honor man's good response, irrespective of what the obvious consequences of that good action may be, for example, execution of all those involved by the king. This implies a kind of manipulation of God and his plan by man. It is never said what she should have done, but treason with lies, unlike treason without lies, is evil. Legalists will see it in no other light. If the imposed exegesis of legalism were valid, then we should expect to find the greatest biblical praise heaped on the closed-mouthed traitors of Scripture, the traitor of Judges 1:24-26, or the regicide of Judges 3:12 and following. Who can quarrel from the legalist's perspective with the fact that in the latter example, the children of Israel sent a present unto Eglon, the king of Moab, 3:15b. The quote-unquote present may have been a knife in the belly, but no one complains that Ehud gained access to the king's chambers by promising to deliver this present. Quote, "It's all in what we call a thing. Rahab told a lie, which was wrong. Ehud delivered a sharp present, which was perfectly honest." End quote. But the Bible does not reserve the greatest praise for these men. Rahab is the recurring example of godly obedience. This fact should warn us against the consequences of exegetical tampering with the plain truth of Scripture. What Rahab was by the standards of Jericho was a treasonous whore. The Bible regards her as an obedient saint. The legalists see her as a naughty girl. She told a white lie. Legalism misses the issues involved, whether from the point of view of the Jericho authorities or from the point of view of the covenantal history of God's people. Legalism dilly-dallies with the periphera of life, while men live and die in terms of crises. Where legalism flourishes, Christians grow ethically overcautious and culturally impotent. With this as background, we come to the heart of this essay. Bribery is a sin, if it is a sin, of far less impact than treason, though admittedly it seems to be far more dangerous than telling quote-unquote white lies. Would a pastor in an American pulpit ever preach on the legitimacy of a Christian's offering a bribe to a state official under certain circumstances? Would he counsel such a thing in private? Probably no pastor would ever think of offering such counsel, at least not until some crisis comes, and then he would no doubt feel guilty. Therefore, the principles of exegetical legalism must be focused on the enormous task of explaining the following verses out of existence. A gift is as a precious stone in the eyes of him that hath it. Whithersoever it turneth, it prospereth. Proverbs 17:8. And a gift in secret pacifieth anger, and a reward in the bosom strong wrath. Proverbs 21:14. The author of these proverbs offered us his advice, but few pastors will be willing to follow his lead. That is how deeply legalism is embedded in contemporary Christianity. It is better not to prosper, apparently, than to pay a bribe. Better not to pacify the anger of some corrupt official than to pay him off. This is the inescapable set of conclusions that a consistent legalistic exegesis must produce. It makes a person wonder why Solomon bothered to insert such lines. It is as if he did so only to give nightmares to legalistic commentators. The congregation that listens to the preaching of legalism may someday find itself threatened by an apostate state bent on the persecution of Christians, and that congregation will be helpless. It will die as surely as the two spies would have died if, given the circumstances in which God had placed them, Rahab had not been so naughty. Scratch a legalist, and underneath you will find a sanctimonious ostrich. Legalism hardens the heart and softens the brain. It results in cultural impotence. What the Bible condemns is the taking of bribes, since it is assumed that godly men will enforce God's laws without payoffs. A bribe may not be accepted for one's own personal profit, either for perverting justice or for administering justly. But the Bible nowhere condemns the giving of bribes in order to impede the progress of apostate governments. Quote-unquote bribery, as such, is no more condemned than quote-unquote treason, as such. It all depends on whose laws or whose nation is being defied. There can be no neutral, universal application of a word like bribery, for to make such a universal definition, we would have to assume the existence of some universal, neutral, and completely accepted legal code. That is the basic presupposition of humanism, but Christianity denies such neutrality. Neutrality does not exist. Everything must be interpreted in terms of what God has revealed. The humanistic goal of neutral language, and therefore neutral law, was overturned at the Tower of Babel. Our definitions must be in terms of biblical revelation. Resistance to unjust laws is not anarchy. Resistance to just laws is anarchy. Rahab was right, though her apostate state would have regarded her as treasonous. Judas Iscariot was wrong, though an apostate state regarded his actions as exemplary and rewarded him handsomely. There is no universal definition of a concept like treason. God's law and his specific guidance determine what is or is not treasonous or anarchistic. Rahab was the saint, and Judas was the traitor. The exegesis of legalism inevitably forces its followers to conclude that the officially disobedient underground church in Hitler's days or in Red China today is really in the same position as the officially disobedient Black Panther Party or the contemporary Satanistic cults. No doubt Romans 13 would be cited, and Acts 5:29, utterly ignored. What's sauce to the goose is sauce to the gander, legalism and other forms of humanism assert. Christianity denies it, for Christianity denies its premise. There can be no universal, neutral principles of law, language, or culture. God's requirement for men is that they subdue the earth in terms of His revealed law structure, and that they do it to His glory. This means that whenever Christian men are in positions of authority in any government, family, civil, educational, financial, ecclesiastical, they are to render judgment in terms of God's standards. This may help to explain why the early Christian churches often prohibited their members from serving in positions of high responsibility in the civil government. Only after the accession of Constantine to the emperor's dominion was it to become proper to serve as a high civil official. God therefore made it plain to the Hebrew rulers that any taking of bribes was illegal in terms of His law. Men were to govern in God's civil kingdom in a righteous manner and for His glory. Personal gain through bribes was illegitimate. It was assumed in the Holy Commonwealth that all cases of bribe-taking were motivated by the desire to pervert God's judgment for the sake of personal profit. When we examine the various passages dealing with bribery that are found in the law, we discover that bribes are linked with unrighteous judgment. The basic formula dealing with bribe-taking is found in Exodus 23:8. "And thou shalt take no gift, for the gift blindeth the wise, and perverteth the words of the righteous." A parallel and even more explicit passage is Deuteronomy 16:18-19. Rulers are to be able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. Exodus 18:21. Perverting God's judgment for personal gain is what is condemned, and it should come as no surprise that only a few sentences away from Solomon's advocacy of giving a bribe, Proverbs 17:8, we find this warning: "A wicked man taketh a gift out of the bosom to pervert the ways of judgment." 17:23. This same perversion of judgment was the sin of Samuel's sons, 1 Samuel 8:3. It was the sin catalogued in Isaiah 1:23, Amos 5:12, Psalms 26:10, and 1 Samuel 12:3. God's criticism is straightforward. Men are wicked if they take bribes to pervert righteous judgment. God's laws are our only standard. We are to follow His lead in the appropriate way, the way creatures must follow. Analogously, "Wherefore now let the fear of the Lord be upon you. Take heed and do it, for there is no iniquity with the Lord our God, nor respect of persons, nor taking of gifts." 2 Chronicles 19:7. Yet we are told that God does take gifts in this very book, 32:23. Thus, we must see the evil of gift-taking as the evil associated with unrighteous judgment and taking respect of persons. It is not gift-taking as such that is evil. Taking a bribe is synonymous with perverting judgment in the Scriptures. It is prohibited in the affairs of civil justice. The example of the father who accepts a gift from his child is analogous to God's acceptance of the gifts in 2 Chronicles 32:23. He must not favor the child with judgments contrary to God's law, due to his respect for the gift. The setting in which God set down His law was one in which an earthly civil kingdom was being established. In the New Testament times, civil power had been transferred to a pagan ruler. The change of setting involves a different emphasis on the responsibilities of those who are ruled. Jesus' parable of the unjust judge is typical. The judge, first of all, feared not God, neither regarded men. Luke 18:2. The widow comes to him in order to be avenged of her adversary, and she harasses the judge continually. Finally, he can stand it no longer. He announces in desperation, "Though I fear not God, nor regard man, yet because this widow troubleth me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me." Verses 4-5. It is ethically proper for a widow with a righteous cause to harass an unrighteous judge if she believes that by doing so she will receive righteous judgment. This in no way sanctions the right of a corrupt woman to disturb the peace of a righteous judge who is truly too busy to give immediate attention to her case. In a very real sense, the woman of the parable offers the judge a bribe. If he renders judgment, she offers him peace. The legalist is usually stunned by the implications of certain portions of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus offers some remarkable suggestions, remarkable from the legalist's point of view, for the conduct of day-to-day life. What Jesus was giving to His disciples was a series of recommendations for the ethical conduct of a captive people. For example, agree with thine adversary quickly, whiles thou art in the way with him, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to the judge, and the judge deliver thee to the officer, and thou be cast into prison. Matthew 5:25. That rule was a wise one in Judean lands during the time of the Roman Empire. It should not lead us to believe that the Christian attitude toward an enemy of God ought to be one of perpetual forgiveness and unending toleration when Christians have the power and authority legally to prosecute and convict him. If Christians as God's people should be given the power of the sword, then the adversaries of God should take seriously the warning of Matthew 5:25. Let them agree with the Christian, lest for their outward lawlessness in disagreeing, the Christian should see to it that righteous judgment be applied in a civil suit, and the adversaries be severely punished. On the other hand, to the extent that any Christian's position in any period of time should resemble the plight of the Christians under Roman rule, then he should take heed. Under the rule of a Hitler or a Stalin, the Christian's proper response is outward subservience. He should bribe the dictator's lieutenants, lie if necessary, join a Christian underground, and gain freedom of action through the lies and bribes to continue preaching and publishing. And if, as in the case of Ehud, the Christians are faced with an evil, triumphant, invading army, such as Christians in the Netherlands and other countries faced in World War II, a successful execution of the invading tyrant might be the proper course of action. Give him his quote-unquote present. He deserves it. Christ warns his people explicitly, "And if any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also, and whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain." Matthew 5:40-41. Christ therefore informs his followers that they should give to those in power over them, that is, if any compel thee, an extra quantity of goods and services over and above the original request. If such a gift were voluntary, we would call such an action a tip or charity. What then should we call such an action under conditions involving external coercion? There is a word for it, of course, but legalists may shrink from it. What Jesus advocates is for Christians to bribe the offending official. A bribe is a gift over and above what is legally required or asked for, a gift which will encourage the offending party to leave the Christian and the church in peace. It enables the Christian to escape the full force of the wrath that, in principle, a consistent pagan would impose on Christians if he realized how utterly at war Christ and his kingdom are against Satan and his kingdom. In other words, the bribe pacifies the receiver, just as Solomon said it does. The ethic of the Sermon on the Mount is grounded on the principle that a godly bribe of goods or services is sometimes the best way for Christians to buy temporary peace and freedom for themselves and the church, assuming the enemies of God have overwhelming temporal power. Such a bribe must be given in good conscience in order to achieve a righteous end. Christian citizens or servants are not thereby granted a license to offer the rulers bribes in order to achieve unrighteous ends. Nevertheless, this one fact should be apparent. Turning the other cheek is a bribe. It is a valid form of action for only so long as the Christian is impotent politically or militarily. By turning the other cheek, the Christian provides the evil coercer with more peace and less temporal danger than he deserves. By any economic definition, such an act involves a gift. It is an extra bonus to the coercing individual that is given only in respect of his power. Remove his power, and he deserves punishment. An eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. Remove his power, and the battered Christian should either bust him in the chops or haul him before the magistrate, and possibly both. It is only in a period of civil impotence that Christians are under the rule to resist not evil, Matthew 5:39. When Christians are given power in civil affairs, the situation is different, and another rule is imposed. Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you, James 4:7. The same holds true for the devil's disciples. Martin Luther once saw the devil, or something he thought was the devil, and he hurled an inkwell at him. He had other suggestions, even more earthy, as to how we should handle the devil. That should be the attitude of all Christians who possess authority. We pay the bribe until the day that God's adversaries lose power, but not one day longer.